Hey, what's up everybody? My name's Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. Today you and I are going to be looking at this chord progression and starting a melodic patch from scratch within Phase Plant. I wanted to go through this because generally I write with sine waves as opposed to piano or something, and then I'll start to shape the sound over time depending on what I'm working with. And I thought it would be a good idea to maybe go through this process for somebody that might want to pick up a couple tricks on how to start from nothing to something. So if that seems interesting, I would appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're really just working with a sine wave right now in this chord progression, so let's take a listen to how that sounds. So it's nothing special, but I think that working with sine waves is great because it's the most malleable, right? It's just a single pure harmonic, and with that there's a lot of stuff that we can do in order to make it seem a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about some of the obvious things. The first thing is that we can change this from just an analog to a wavetable, and sometimes it's a good idea to kind of just cycle through. So if we kind of do that, and you might want to put an LFO on that or something, as you can here, or you might want to maybe use a macro or something to be able to automate how the timbre changes over time, but obviously that's like a Captain Obvious one. So the other thing that we can do is we really want to talk about the relationship between creating like different timbres, sorry, not timbres, but creating different timings via the ADSR, because you can do a lot of really cool stuff. So for example, if I were to grab a macro here and pull the decay down and pull the sustain down, kind of like so. And maybe what we will also do is we'll have the attack kind of up like this and pull this down. Then what this is going to do is it's going to transform between something that's kind of like a pad and something that's more like a pluck. So take a listen. That should be, there we go. And so what's cool about this is you can kind of add a little bit of percussiveness to it, or you can also like create it to make it to where it comes in slowly. And it doesn't really matter how you want to, utilize that, but sometimes you want something to swell in, or sometimes you want something to come in super fast. And so by having something like pad versus pluck, you can utilize this to create different movements within your instrument. It doesn't have to just be like a piano will never be anything outside of a piano on its own, right? Unless if you do some kind of processing. But when you're doing electronic design, you can make the same exact kind of timbre transform into something that is percussive, or something that is ethereal, something that is whatever. And I'd say do that because that makes the sound a lot cooler. So the other thing that we have is, I'm going to put a limiter on this because that's just what I always do. I want to use a filter here to where we're going to play along with this as well. So whenever we move this, I'm going to move the filter down just a bit, maybe to like here. And then I'm going to use this envelope to create a pluck sound. So within this, the reason why this is cool is because now if we move this back to the beginning, then you'll see that this is going to just play the pad out. And if we move this up, that's just going to accentuate. That's kind of cool. So within that, there's already a lot of different movements that we can add to this, and like we're going to kind of save reverb and like chorus and all that other stuff towards the end, but I want to talk more so about, let's create more harmonics, let's create some more movements. So the next thing that we can consider is adding in another wavetable or so. And I want to talk about some basic FM principles. So for one, if we just add this here, then, you know, it's just going to sound like this. Which is cool. Generally, when you do FM, you raise a harmonic, so... But that kind of makes it a little bit harsh, right? So maybe what we can do is duplicate this envelope here and make this a little bit shorter. Sorry, that's the one that we want to keep. We'll make this one a little bit shorter. And we're going to set this to the gold star right here, right below phase. And so what this is going to do is it's going to apply a little bit of FM during this, but then it's going to back off. Now, it will sound a little bit different if you add shift to this instead. Not by much, but it does have a slightly different timbre, and you can watch on the waveform what's happening. So we've got our sine wave here. Let's add that here. You see how this has this pattern? And if you add this to the shift, this will add this pattern. So it's similar, but a little bit different in how that works. And so experimenting with those different kinds of methodologies will give you some interesting stuff. And the other thing too, which we'll talk about here in a second, is ring modulation or amplitude modulation, which will also further make this a little bit more physical. So the thing that I wanted to talk about as well is that you don't have to have this as a perfect harmonic. You can actually do something like whatever. And when you do this, if you set the pluck to a very short amount, then that's actually going to give it a slightly more physical sound because it's going to be like detune. And I don't want to talk about physical modeling too much, but this is a good way to kind of just have something sound like an inharmonic at the very beginning and then go into something that's tonal. Now with this, we need to add this here. And that sounds very natural. So that's pretty sick. Let's go ahead and add another one. And what we're going to do to this one is kind of the same thing, but let's turn this off so that way we can kind of tell the difference of what's happening. And I'm going to set this one to 19 semitones because that's just usually what I go for. You can set this to whatever you want, but we're going to basically do the same thing, but apply this to the level here. And you'll see that this is going to change the waveform in a kind of softer way. And now we can add another envelope to, control how much of the amplitude modulation we have. Actually, let's turn this off for a second and let's just listen to what that sounds like. And together with both, you can see that we can create some really cool bells and stuff kind of like that. Now, again, it depends on what it is that you want to do, because you might not want to have a bell sound. You might want to have some kind of, some kind of ethereal pad or something. And that's where we can get into the unison. The unison will really kind of spread everything out. It'll also not make those sine waves so like resonant, I guess, because what's going to happen is phase cancellation actually, which is kind of neat, because if the sine waves are all playing together in phase, then they sound kind of like a little sharp and a little peaky. But once you introduce that phase cancellation through spreading the voices out and everything is kind of smearing against each other, it creates some nicer tones, I guess. That's nice. So something else that we can do is we can kind of pinpoint that general area, which is right here, and kind of just back off of that so that way it's not so loud. You can also compress it if you want to kind of tame everything. But now that we kind of have all this stuff, really what we want to think about is just building harmonics or building movement for the sound. So depending on what it is that you're going for, right, I'm not really trying to make something specific other than something that sounds nice. And this sounds kind of cool. It reminds me of something from like, I don't know, a Super Nintendo or whatever that only has sine waves to work with. But what we can start thinking about now is maybe even perhaps adding some harmonics. And I don't want to get too much into wavetable synthesis and stuff, but a good place to start is to just realize that for the most part, not every time, but for the most part, this needs to be the highest harmonic that you have, which is your fundamental. I guess I can show you an example, but if you don't have a fundamental harmonic, then you end up getting some stuff like this, which is kind of akin, like, it's okay, but it's kind of akin to basically high passing, right? Because this is the very first harmonic. But you lose the energy if you remove that. Or I guess the presence or the power, I don't really know how people describe that, but so as a general rule of thumb, if you kind of just do something like this, or even something like this, now the other thing to consider is that whenever you're talking about harmonics here, if you kind of smear everything like I just did, I think you can hear that it sounded more like a saw wave, and I don't think that it's going to sound like that because we don't have the FM, but let's see what this sounds like. No, it still does. So when you have something like that and all the harmonics are kind of like similarly matched and blended like that, two things can happen. One is you end up getting either a saw wave or a square, or if you do the whole thing, then you end up just getting like white noise. But the other thing that's kind of interesting is if you just focus on peaking one harmonic or maybe spread them out like this, then it's going to drastically change and have a lot more nuance while still retaining towards that sine wave. See how it's almost sounding a little bit more like an organ now? Which is pretty cool. So maybe right here what we can do is, that's a saw wave, so we'll just do something kind of cool like that. Just for funsies, we'll remove this, and then we'll keep the third harmonic. I'm going to kind of speed ahead a little bit now. Maybe we'll add a fifth and a seventh, kind of like, that's an eighth, kind of like so, and just kind of have some other stuff floating around. And then maybe from here, we're going to go back to a sine wave, but we're just going to add a third. And something else that you should experiment with is you'll see these little knobs down here, and what these do is they rotate the phase of the harmonic. And so it doesn't, it's like an inadvertent way to shape more timbre and stuff. Like, it will make a subtle difference, but a lot of it has to do with the relationship that it creates between the harmonics. So for example, you'll see that the phase of the top of the waveform is here now. And then if I rotate this, then we can actually move that around. I wish that you could automate this, because that would be, or modulate or something, because that would be really cool, but it's okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to morph this to here. And one thing with morphing these wavetables is if you have multiple stages and you're doing this like after editing, then you can't just do this because it's not going to morph. Actually, it is. What I would recommend though is from here to here, just morph this piece. So like this, and then go done. Then from here to here, oops, hit that morph button, and now that'll morph. And then when you get to this spot, now morph this. And so that way it's going to have multiple stages of where it's going through, because generally I think that if you just do from this to this, it's going to take the first one and the last one and create some weird thing in between, as opposed to keeping all of the other positions in mind, or all of the other frames rather. So now that we have that, we've got a more complex sound. I guess there is just a pure sine wave in there somewhere, but that's okay. So now let's listen to how that sounds whenever we modulate through this. this is kind of nice because when we turn it into a pad, we're kind of letting go of some of the FM stuff, and then we can kind of move over through that. But that's kind of cool. So the next piece that we have is we can talk about distortion, because sometimes when you have a single harmonic, or just a couple anyways, and you start sending that through, then you'll end up getting some interesting stuff. You want to be careful with this because sometimes you can definitely overdo it. So for example, if I just turn this here and play that out, then you get that crunchy sound. Sometimes that could be cool. I guess since that sounds kind of nice, then something else that we can consider is grabbing an LFO. We can turn the note trigger to never and set this to a really slow rate. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to grab that master pitch and just modulate it kind of like this. And now you'll see that we are adding a little bit of like warble to it. If you want to go for something that's kind of lo-fi, then we can obviously go for our bit crusher. You want to kind of modulate between these different things here, and also generally if you have like really harsh resonances, so let's see what this sounds like. Yeah, so if you turn this up, this will help kind of like mellow it out. See? And then if we want to add that crunch on top, then we can add some noise with the bits. The dither will create noise. This is more for lower frequencies, but so if you wanted to make that lo-fi, then what we could do is we can turn this up, maybe not all the way, and then we can also grab this here and lower this, and we'll just call that lo-fi. Low, sure. So the reason why this works is because we can actually add a depth to this on a modulator. So if we don't want this to go the entire time, then we can just say, all right, well, whenever this macro turns, we're going to open the modulator up. Whenever this opens, we're going to open up the mix on this. So it'll kind of extend out, which is kind of nice. Sounds good. Now with this, you might not always want that, so you could always do like just map that to something if you want, or something else that we can maybe consider is using an envelope here. And what this will do is whenever we activate this, it will add in some mix on the drive, so that way it's going to start soft and then maybe get more harsh over time. So that sounds really cool. Okay, so there's that. Now the other thing that we can get into is looking at adding different stuff to this. So on one end, what we can do is we can add another oscillator here, which we can just start with a sine wave, and generally fifths and octaves work really well. If you want to be experimental, then you can also get into some other stuff, but I think for now let's just start with a fifth and see how that sounds. This sounds pretty cool. We can also turn this to a second harmonic. Or we can bring this back down and just a second harmonic would basically be an octave. That sounds pretty cool. So maybe what we can do with this is not bring that in all the way, but we can have something that has another LFO on this, and we can bring this in at really slow times. So maybe like every second bar. And then again, what we'll do is we'll set this trigger on here to never. And then we want to kind of just add this in just a little bit. So maybe not the whole thing, but it'll kind of bring in some harmonization with this. And it doesn't really matter what you want to do. You can, you know, make it a fifth, make it an octave, whatever. And you can also change the waveform if you want to. You can also filter this. So we can bring this above here and we can put a filter here so that way it's not affecting the sine wave. And then if you wanted to, we could even do something like this to where this will kind of open up and create some movement here. I know that was a lot that really just happened very fast if you're not used to seeing how this works, but basically we added a filter and then we used the same envelope to open it up. So now if you watch, when the distortion opens, the filter of this is also going to open. That sounds pretty cool. You can use a notch, you can use whatever it is you want. You can have multiple filters stacked, but basically within the chain, whatever is below this is going to be affected. So if you want to have a clean signal, then you want to put that signal as close to the envelope as possible. So for example, if we didn't want to have the distortion on our base wavetable here, our fundamental wavetable, then we can just move this below the distortion, and now everything that's going to go here is going to feed into this, and then this is going to be clean. Something else that you can do, which I do sometimes, I don't always do, but you can use an auxiliary. And so what this is going to do is it's going to take the sum of everything here. You're going to take this envelope and send it to this. And so now what this is going to do is this is kind of like the sum of all sounds, but in one controllable parameter. And you can add distortion and filtering and stuff. I don't think that FM works quite well with this because you can add it to this, but it doesn't. Yeah, I guess it does, but I don't know. I've had some weird issues with that before in the past of not making it what I want to do. But yeah, if you want to take the sum of all the sounds and not just affect a single waveform, then you can apply that as well. So yeah, okay. So what this does is it doesn't actually do FM. I thought that something was fishy there. This just applies volume to this waveform, because if you listen to this without it, yeah, so you do lose the ability to do FM. That would be really cool if you could just take the sum of this and then like FM, like that entire signal or whatever. That could be nice, but there's other use cases of why this might be useful, especially if you want to send everything out. If you are going to auxiliary stuff or use an aux, then you might want to send this to sideband, so that way you're not double stacking, because this is still going to play out. So, but if you send this into lane 1, then that means that this is going to be sending into lane 1, and now a copy of this is going to be sent into lane 1 as well. So that's not always ideal, but that's just something to know. And it's like, well, why would you do that? Well, sometimes if you use ring modulation or some other stuff here, where is ring mod? It's got to be, there it is. Then you can say the modulator is going to be that sideband. So now you'll see that this movement or whatever on this is going to be attached to the ring mod, and it's not going to be going to the outside. You can also do like some crazy side chaining with this as well, but I haven't studied enough on that. And you might be asking me, well, Alckemy, why do I want to use a ring mod? Well, I don't know. Do you like the way that it sounds? You know, that would probably be the number one question is, do you like the way that it sounds as opposed to like what's right and what's wrong? So in any case, what I want to talk about now is getting into some other aspects of harmonization. And what's cool about this, not multipass, I'm going to use snap heap, is that you can start to create pseudo chords with this. And what we can do is we can create these lanes here. And I'm going to close out of all these modulators here. That's just my default thing. But what we can do is set all of these into parallel, except for this last one here, and turn this on. That's just like, hey, this is going on. And what I want to do is we are going to map these here to, will be like 0 or whatever plus 17, and then we'll do this for each subsequent lane. Now the reason why we want to do this is because we can utilize these macros to fade them in over time, and then we can actually modulate how these work, which is something that can be really nice, especially when you're trying to come up with like, I don't know, something that's a little bit more complex. So this is a little bit of setup, and I apologize if it's boring, but I promise it'll be worth it here in just a second. But what we want to do with these is basically turn them to where they're all off. Yeah. Maybe this last one we can just leave it as a clean, and that way it's always going to affect the signal. But now what we can do is we can start to play with different kinds of effects. So one thing that is really popular is, or that I do that's really popular, is using a pitch shifter with different amounts. Actually, I'll just do this. We can set this to like 19. Maybe we can set this to like, I don't know, 12. So again, increments of fifths. If you want to create a more complex chord, then you can do that. But what's really cool now is once we start to add these in, there we go. Check this out. But that's not it, because this is not the Alckemy way. So what we can do is start adding different effects on here in order to, maybe just an LFO. But yeah, we can start adding different effects on here in order to get some really complex movement. So we can kind of add something like that. We can maybe sync this to where it's a little bit slow. Maybe on this one, we wanted to add in a delay. And we might want to modulate that as well. So we probably don't always want that to come up. So we'll set that to 0 and then set this to bounce and then set that to duck. And then maybe we can do like a bar or something. Now remember with this, we don't want it to re-trigger. So we're just going to set it to never from no on. I don't know why it does that. And something to be mindful of as well, and you'll see me do this on my Requiem patches and whatnot, is that you might want this to re-trigger, but the problem is that if you save this rack, then it's not going to recognize MIDI if you throw it on an audio signal. So let's say I save this rack or whatever, and I want it to apply to, I don't know, a sample, right? I don't know. I want to apply this to a snare just because sound design. If you toss a snap heap thing on here, it's not going to have any MIDI to re-trigger it. So sometimes what you'll have to do, and what you might want to do rather, what you might want to consider, is basically using this little setup called an audio follower with an envelope. And what this is going to do is you set the audio follower to go to the envelope, and now this is going to basically pseudo trigger MIDI whenever the audio hits in. So it has to hit above a certain threshold in order for this to go, but check this out. Sorry, wrong one. We need to be back over here to this. There we go. All right, so you see how this isn't going up, and you see that this thing right here is not triggering. So in order to get this to work, we got to boost that gain a bit and turn the release up to something that's going to be now you see that it's triggering. So basically it's creating a pseudo signal, or like a pseudo, I guess, trigger in which to control things. And the reason why this is important is because if you want something like a filter or whatever, or, you know, you can do all different kinds of stuff, but we can open this up and say, okay, or maybe what we'll do is we'll set this to go down. And now whenever this triggers, it's going to open up because it's having the audio attached to it. So within that, and you'll notice that within a lot of the Requiem stuff that I do when it comes into making musical things and percussive generators and whatnot, but that's one of the big tricks that I use. The other thing that you can do is to kind of have some other stuff or have different aspects of delay come about, which is sometimes really nice. Because if you start thinking about like smearing stuff and kind of having these washes, then you can create like really interesting pads that with all of this movement and stuff will kind of sound, I guess, really good. Sometimes it sounds like crap because it's just like, but you can always filter that stuff out, or you can always control how much of this signal that you want to add. So maybe on this one we can just add a phaser. I'm not really thinking about this too much. We can also perhaps add a comb filter with some stereo. We don't want it to be all the way. And then on this one I'll use a convolution with Falkland whatever. We can stretch this up all the way and leave this here. But now within these, we can make this, we can use these as either macros or we can do some other stuff with it, which I'll show you in a second. But let's just play with this for a hot minute and see what we can get. Probably should have done it at the beginning of the video, I'm sorry. So something else that we can do just for funsies is we can actually just apply this to the master, because if you do this on every individual one, it can get kind of tedious, and I'm really lazy and I want to be as efficient as possible. But if you want to make this even more percussive, it's not going to matter when it's in pad mode because it's the volume's not even going to come in. But if we set this to like, I don't know, 19, and we give this just a little bit of a pitch bend, well, now that's going to make that even more percussive. So and then what we could also do is we can close this and map that kind of like how we did before to that depth here. And again, we've only got 2 macros that are kind of on this, but we've got some cool stuff that's kind of happening from this now. We can set this to a mix, and that's something that I do a lot, which is making a rack and then setting that there, and then we'll just call this dreaming. I don't know, because it's got ethereal stuff within it that will make it sound kind of cool. But from here, maybe we can also add in a table. And I usually do this at the end of this, unless if I'm going for something very specific right within this. But usually I'll do all this other stuff at the end, because now I'm like, I got all this control to do whatever and make it as interesting as possible. And keep in mind too that you can modulate this stuff. Something else that is, you know, good to be mindful of is that you can modulate any macros, keyword any macros that are within these racks. So for example, if I wanted to do something interesting with this, say like a 4/4 or whatever, I can actually modulate this rack here. Now you can also do it inside of this if you want to, but just for the sake of being cool and showing you interesting tricks that could be helpful, you'll see that this is now moving on its own and doing its own thing. So if we pull this back up, I move this before the compressor, so that way we don't have to do multiple instances of compression. Sounds pretty nice. So something else that we can do, and then I'll probably wrap up the video because we've been here for 36 minutes now, is talking about making pseudo sequences within this. So there's a lot that you can do in order to make a sequence, but I'm going to keep it relatively simple because we already have a chord progression, and you can make, like, you know, your own melody or whatever, but that really works best if you stick to one note at a time. So I guess I can show you what I mean. If we take an LFO, or actually let's do an LFO table because I've taught this trick before, but if we grab this and we set this here to, I think, this mode, and we hold Option if you're on a Mac. Nope, wrong one. I think it's just this one. Nope. It's the points. Give me the points. We need the magnet. There we go. All right. So we can actually create different steps like this, as you can see, which is kind of cool. And this is arbitrary. It doesn't matter. I mean, I guess it does when it comes into like trying to be specific with melody, but try not to be like too meticulous with it. But what we can do is we can move over to the last one now, and we can create a completely different melody. So we'll drag this down to something different and probably remove that. So we can start like here, move this one up, move this one down. I don't know. I have this up down mentality. It comes from martial arts. If you've ever done Aikido or Judo or throwing or something, you know, and you're talking about leading somebody, you either go in, out, in, or up, down, up, and so I have that natural tendency to want to do stuff like that with everything that I do. If like it needs to be opposite, but it really doesn't matter. Just create some kind of thing. But what's cool about this now is you'll see that we've created this cool and interesting melody that is moving in between. If you crossfade this, sometimes you can end up getting some other cool shit too. If we go spectral, sometimes it'll do this, which is super neat. And then you can use the smoothing on the LFO table in order to get some different stuff. But yeah, this is a really cool way to actually get like insane wavetables just by actually using steppers and stuff. But we'll talk about that in another video. So we've got this morpher now, which is interesting. And now what we can do is set this to a really slow rate. So for example, like yeah, let's set the retrigger to, yeah, we'll set it to auto. That's fine. Now, if we set this to something that's like an octave, then the issue that we're going to get is it's not going to sound in key. Welcome to your worst nightmare. I'm just kidding. But yeah, if you play a chord with this, it's going to sound like shit. Right? Which, I don't know, maybe that's what you're going for. You want to do like insane clown music that is trying to scare the fuck out of your loved ones. That's one thing that you can do. But something else that you can consider is using a remap. And if you set a remap to this and switch this over to a scale, so Dorian, Locrian, Lydian. I usually go for Phrygian because that's just, I don't know, I like Phrygian. And then we set this to the same thing. Remember, this goes to this, goes to this, and we can set this to 24, 12, doesn't really matter. Now what this is going to do is it's going to lock this into scale. So this works pretty well if you only use one note. But if you play everything together, it's just going to sound like nothing. So I would recommend just one note. Which is really interesting about this because this is actually seeming like it's in between notes. So there is a little bit of kind of stuff that you might want to play with this. Let me set this to 12 instead and see what that does. And then we can just adjust this really quick because I don't want this to sound like total garbage while I'm trying to demonstrate something interesting. But if we set this here and then maybe set this here, no, yes, yes, maybe something like this. If for some reason it's catching these in-between notes, and that might be because of the dreamy thing that's turned on. So we'll see what happens from there, but let's make this all the way up. No one can stop me. I hate that song with a passion. Let's see what this does and see if that's any better, and hit done. And now this should, let's go ahead and morph this and see if that's any cooler. Maybe let's set this to a minor. It's a little better. But anyways, you can set this to a sequence, and I guess this is a very rare case because usually this actually works. Maybe there's something else that I'm doing with this to make it sound strange, but yeah, you can make melodies and set this to a scale and utilize that. But like I said, I would recommend not doing that if you're going to play chords. And so behind all this, you can create some really interesting stuff to just like and automate all these over time. So let's do that just for fun. What I'm going to do, because I'm lazy and I don't feel like doing stuff like this, is we're going to create some more LFOs here. And people always give me shit about like, man, you've got so many modulators here, but now you see why, is because when you start from nothing and you start building and you start having, okay, hold on a second there, kilohertz. When you start building from nothing, then you end up getting some interesting stuff that you're like, oh, imagine if this moved on its own. Imagine if this moved on its own. Imagine if this moved on its own. Now, we're just going to use regular LFOs on all of these just to prove a point. But what we will do is we're going to set these to different intervals. Time intervals, rather. So now we're going to get a little bit more of a complex sound from all this stuff moving together on its own. So enjoy. This is actually way too fast. This needs to be like really slow. This is also way too fast. It needs to be like really slow. So the last thing that we're going to do is I want to leave on a high note because I'm not really satisfied with the melody thing that I was teaching. But what we can do is we're just going to use this in octaves now, and we're going to drag this over here and set this to 12. So now what this is going to do is it's going to play with octaves, and what you can do is you can actually have it set to low octave, medium octave, high octave. Actually, let's do that. So that way you all know what I'm talking about. But if you go low, we need to snap that. Then we go mid. And then we go high, like this. Uh-oh. Don't worry about it being evenly distributed. It's not really that big of a deal. But we have all the way at the bottom, in the middle, all the way at the top. And now if we set this to be super slow, like this, then what we can do is this is going to jump around and basically play between these different octaves. Maybe we'll set this to like 16. And the other thing that we can do to make this cool is we can add in a little bit of randomization from something that's going to be consistent. So we can randomly move the phase over this way. And now you're going to see that this is going to jump to different spots. And maybe what we can do is just set that to sync. So every once in a while, this might jump a different octave or so. So now let's take a listen to how that sounds. So this is really interesting because I'm starting to feel under the impression that something is going up with these modulators here, because generally speaking, if this is set to 12 and this is evenly distributed, this should be working. So what is the deal with that? Because all these values are absolute. So I'm not really sure. You're going to have to go in and mess with this, and that's really strange. But what happens if we just set this to an octave, maybe? Will this do the same thing and be strange, or will it jump? No, I had it right. No. Edit. Undo. 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 There we go. So let's see if that still sounds weird. That's really odd. Okay, well that works. And with that, we've created a much more complex kind of sound that we can manipulate and change and do all different kinds of things to. But the moral of the story is that start with something simple, add harmonics to it, find something that you can add movement to, whether it be filters or pitch shifters or something. And then if you want it to go on its own, because I would go back and manually edit all this stuff, but I just kind of let it set it and forget it just to prove a point, or to show an example rather. But just starting from sine waves, there's a bunch of different stuff that you can go into. We also can talk about physical modeling at some point. We can also talk about, using different waveforms, or using granular synthesis, or FMing some kind of granular sound with a sine wave. But there's just only so much that I can cover within a video before I get my brain cooked. I'm also a little bit salty that the melody thing didn't really work out, because stick around for just a second. Whenever we talk about how I build these patches from the ARCANUM series and stuff, I've got a lot of things in here that have sequences built into them. And so I'm not really sure why it was doing that, but what can you say? So if you take a look at something like this, you'll see that I've got the spacing and the chord depth. And if you look at some of this stuff on here, let me figure out which racks these are. That's the pluck rack. You'll see that it's pretty much the same setup with some extra settings and then some other randomization and on there. And then if you look at the other stuff that I have, like the space, then you'll see that it's just different means of space with modulation and stuff to make it sound bigger. So if we were to apply this sound to perhaps this guy right here, this might be loud. Nope, it's okay. Then we can do pretty much the same thing by adding these macros in. But if you look at the sequence here, you'll see that there's this. We've got our remap on here, and it's in key. So I don't know what was up with that patch, but I didn't do anything different. So in any case, that's kind of one way that you can get through that and kind of make some cool stuff. Again, I don't really know what I did wrong, but you can definitely make a arpeggiator, a pseudo arpeggiator anyways, or some kind of sequencer within that. Hopefully somehow Kilohertz will add that in a future update. But if you're interested in checking out these patches and whatnot, then I suggest that you check out Requiem 2. And otherwise than that, hopefully you learned something and had a good time with this lesson, because there's a lot of cool random tricks that I just decided to throw together. So thank you all so much for watching. I know that it was a long video, but I really appreciate it, and I hope that you all have an awesome New Year's and rest of your evening. I'll see you all later. Goodbye. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Take care then. Bye bye now.